great pleasure to introduce Professor James Law from Newcastle University. James has quite, I think, eclectic background. He started out as a linguist, then became a speech and language therapist, and is now a professor of speech and language science at Newcastle University. I think for most of us, he's most widely known for his incredible work on longitudinal studies into looking at the outcomes for children who have speech and language issues very early on in their education, and has written a huge number of reviews really looking at, do interventions work, what are the life chances for children who have language difficulties very early on, and that's certainly where we've very much looked at James's work to sort of see what we ought to be doing in LuCiD. So I think without any further ado, I'll pass over to James.
Thank you very much. Oh, well, thank you for inviting me. We've got ages, so you can ask questions as you're going along if you want to. I've got quite a few slides. I might pass over some of them quite quickly. I'll look at your faces, and if you look really bored, then I'll just move on. Or in fact, if I feel that in fact we've covered it already, I'll just won't repeat myself. So I'm interested in this term, life chances, here. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about where that came from, because it probably won't be familiar to most of you, unless you've got sociology degrees, which I'm sort of guessing you won't have.
We've got Gina, but not sociology degrees.
I'm sure that will. Yeah, okay. I'm trying to sort of frame some of these discussions in a slightly larger format. My feeling is that a lot of the speech and language therapy world, and also in psychology, operates quite sort of narrow. They're quite sort of specific about individuals, which is very important because they're working with individuals. But there's a wider question here, which there's a lot of people are very interested in, but people you wouldn't necessarily come across. So you see the point now, right? So it's not just researchers, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the life chances agenda. Actually, I'm not sure it is an agenda anymore. It was an agenda last year, and it's sort of an agenda, and it's on the edges of being an agenda. A little bit about child cognitive development and language and how that fits into it. And then I want to show you some of the cohort analysis that I've been involved, other people have been involved in, which I think are relevant as far as this story is concerned. So it's about framing a story, really. And I want to talk a little bit about interventions at the end. And it's referred to the work I've done on this already, and we're still doing more of this stuff. You know, it never goes away because people keep publishing stuff, so you have to keep up to date. Life chances. Where does this come from? This term. It's the original person who generated it is a guy called Max Weber. This is what I meant about sociology, so you'll look completely blank. And that's because you won't necessarily have been introduced to this unless you had perhaps a sociolinguistic course might have picked it up. I don't know, actually. But what the sociologist did, he was in the 1920s, and he generated this term as a sort of probabilistic concept, so almost like a mathematical concept, describing how certain factors in an individual's life will turn out in a certain way. So it is quite big thinking, it's very broad. So according to this theory, life chances are positively correlated with one's socioeconomic status, but it's not just about that. So the opportunities refer to the extent to which one has access to resources, both tangible ones, obvious ones, food, clothing, etc., but also intangible ones such as education and healthcare. Now, I think he did much more on the former than he did on the latter, largely because the health and social care systems in the 20s were pretty rudimentary, so it was quite difficult to do it. But this term has sort of carried on. He didn't do much modelling of it, although it is meant to be a mathematical idea. Essentially, life chances are the individual's ability to procure goods, have a career, obtain inner satisfaction. That was his term. In other words, the ability to satisfy one's needs. Now, so this then went underground for quite a while because it's in the 30s, the economic model sort of changed. people weren't so interested in individual options. And in fact, what's quite interesting is his work has got picked up by a guy called Ralph Dahrendorf, who was a very famous sociologist from the 60s and 70s. And he talked about you can't probably read this if it's at the back, but he talked about the differences between individual autonomy, so your ability to take control over your life, and what he calls social ligatures, which are the links in society. We don't use that term ligatures now, but I guess you'd say sort of neighbourhood effects and things like that. And I think what he was interested in is trying to offset what the individual did in relation to what society did. And so this is an interesting tension, because so now, if you look at the sociologists and what they do with cohorts, for example, I seem to go to a few of these sort of meetings, so I hear quite a lot of this stuff. And the model is essentially that the social factors drive everything, and that individual choices don't really sort of turn up so much in those models, because it's very difficult to pick up individual choices when you're looking at those sorts of data. And it's quite interesting how pervasive that view is. So you can get quite a pessimistic view of society. Well, what they do is, and I think quite a lot of sociologists I think are a bit pessimistic, actually, to be honest, because of their models. But you're left thinking, well, what can we do about it?
Reality, actually.
Well, okay. Well, so there's an issue. If we can discuss that. But the issue is, I suppose, is how much you can change things. So how much is individual chance? How much can you enhance those chances, I suppose? So he said that it's not easy to describe the meaning of life chances. The words come to mind all stem from an organic vocabulary which implies capacities and abilities. People unfold, they grow, they mature, they realise themselves. And life chances are opportunities for individual growth. So, and he made a lot of the education story as education being about life chances. Now, of course, that is being picked up absolutely massively in our political system and in the American political system and all developed countries, I should say. And it's an interesting one about who owns this issue about life chances now. So is it the right or the left? I mean, crudely put, or perhaps we haven't got any right or left anymore. But you know, that idea that it's we may have just moved on actually in the last few weeks, so it's all very current for this. But he was saying that education is the way to do it, and of course, the whole rhetoric around grammar schools is very much about this. But the issue is, who are you giving the life chances to? Because grammar schools isn't about life chances for everybody, it's a life chances for particular groups in the community. But this is not linked to this particular point, although it's interesting that when the current government came in, that issue about grammar schools blew up, didn't it, in August? Maybe they had nothing else to write about in August, but it's gone quiet again now. I think partly because a lot of the Tory MPs said, actually, we don't really want grammar schools. Our schools are fine as they are. So everyone goes, well, the people who thought it was going to be a touchstone then go, ooh, I'm not sure about that. So there's a lot of tension here about who owns this stuff. So I'm now going to go back to the issue about indicators, because these people didn't really talk about indicators. They were talking about it as a concept. Before I do, actually, there's a quote here which you will all know, because you're all Hart and Risley fans, aren't you? Professional families were observed preparing their children for symbolic problem solving, providing them experiences of language diversity, supporting and encouraging them in their problem solving, and nurturing their confidence and motivation, whilst only 1/3 of working class families and none of the welfare families were observed similarly preparing their children. And they write quite a lot about those symbolic skills in relation to the workforce, the modern workforce. I think their solutions were a bit odd, but they grew out of the Head Start model in the States. And so you could see why they said, well, you should send babies to nursery, from birth for about 40 hours a week, because that's the way you change things. And we, of course, don't do that sort of thing. So culturally, things are very different over here. But the issue about life chances partly being about how you think symbolically and the relationship of language to that. I think that's a pretty interesting point. Now, I'm now going on to something else, which is life chances got reinvented in 2010 by a guy called Frank Field, who you will know about, although he's sort of dipped out of the limelight. He was the guy who was asked to think the unthinkable in the Blair government, and he did, and he got sacked. So he came up with this report in 2010, and what he did, he listed a load of life chance indicators. If you look at this political thing, it's a policy document designed to advise the government. It then identified a whole load of things which came out of the literature. So unlike the Michael Gove model of political education, as it were, he was very keen on experts. And he took a lot from what people were saying was the right thing. And if you look at the list of things that he was interested in, I'm sure most of you would just tick them off. You'd go, yep, that's fine. And he was interested in cognitive factors as being a life chance indicator, because what he was saying was that these things are sensitive to environmental factors, and therefore they're in our gift to some extent to engineer, if you like, or modify. And he was one of the people, I know you all knew this already, but for a politician to pick this up, he was saying these issues are pretty much set up by the age of 5. So in the past, so if you listen to the Education Endowment Foundation, they say their role is to reduce inequalities. That's one of their things. Now, the assumption is that in their models is that actually school exacerbates the inequalities, and so you need to modify them. But what this guy was saying, Field was saying, was that actually most of these inequalities are set up well before the children reach school. So school is operating against the background of what's happened already. So it's not enough just to help them, but in order to make them catch up in some way, you need policies which are going to do that. And he said what you need is indicators, so things to measure how these children are doing at particular time points. And then he came up with a number of measures, which again came out of the literature. I've forgotten whether I put them here or not. No, I haven't. But he was taking measures that are used in the British ability scales, for example, which is used in the Millennium Cohort Study, and he took that and said, well, that should be a measure. And of course, it's sort of nonsense, really, because no one's going to do it. There's nobody to do the BAS on everybody. Right, so what we have is the early years foundation stage measure. And as you will know from discussions last year, I'm sure you're very sensitive to this, the government was trying to get shot of it. It thinks that its phonics screening test is the answer to something. But, so there's a little tussle going on at the moment about whether the early years foundation stage stays in. Because as you know, it used to be 5 items, 5 areas, and now it's 3. So the proportion of language in that has gone up quite substantially. And the government has left it in place until they've said next year. Some of you may have inside information to tell you what's happened with that discussion, but actually it is the only indicator currently. There is nothing, there are no other indicators of any of these things apart from that, except when you get to key stage 1. We also have an indicator of sorts at 2.5 or 2 years, 3 months, which is now the Ages and Stages questionnaire. But we haven't nobody's looked at the data for that. Slightly interestingly, they've rolled it out across the whole of England based on an American standardisation, and now they're doing the same in Scotland. So we don't really know how good that's going to be, but that's what's going on. But that's in health, of course, and so that doesn't get as far as education. So, you know what I mean, they don't really talk to each other very much. Well, they're supposed to. And if you listen to Caldecott, as in the Caldecott Guardian, person who deals with ethical issues across the whole of the country, she would say, yes, health and education data should be linked up completely. It doesn't get linked up because at a lower level, people block it. I suspect because it's partly to do with control and who owns information. Anyway, the early years foundation stage is our only indicator, and we've been doing some reports. Well, there's a couple of, actually for some reason, you know, when you get no research, well, not like you actually, because you've got loads of research funding, but most people, you get nothing, and then it all comes along at once. It's like buses. So in the last 6 months, the EIF have commissioned a piece of work on early language from me. The EEF have commissioned something on interventions. And the Communication Trust, which is an umbrella organisation for 50 or so charities with an interest in this area, has just commissioned some work, and there's now a Burko 10 years on report coming out next year, or later this year or sometime anyway, which is going to be doing the same sort of stuff about services. So lots of people are interested. What's interesting is not TCT, because that obviously has a vested interest in these populations, but the EIF and the EEF, I get trouble with this, they're what works clearinghouses. They're government what works centres. So they have no interest in language because they're interested in language. They're not linguists, you know. They're interested because it's potentially a social phenomena which we should be doing more about. And what is interesting about these groups is that they operate in a very interesting policy world where MPs don't come often to academics because they're not sure. They think that academics are selling them things often which they can't really understand. So what the MPs do is the ministers and all that education department, they go to these what work centres. So they're the sort of priest caste which has been developed in the last few years, because they are the intermediaries between the people generating the information, you, and the people doing the policy stuff, as the MPs. We had a little experiment we were going to run, I'm not sure we're going to run it now, but which was to send something to a random control trial of MPs by sending them a graph, right? A randomly controlled, send them bits of information and sending them a graph, and see if we can get them, the ones who had the graph to influence policy more than the ones who were giving the information. Because in most cases MPs actually don't like this sort of stuff, so that's why they go to these intermediaries, and what work centres are those. Right, so get some of our data and then a bit about some other stuff that I'm going to be talking about. So you probably will have seen this, and this is based on the Millennium Cohort Study. And if you look at these things carefully, the whole issue of social factors is based on sociological factors conditioning the outcome you're interested in. If it's not conditioning it, i.e. it's not controlling it in some way, then you really haven't got a story. Right, so if you put in, I don't know, metabolic conditions or something, there probably wouldn't be a story. It'd be flat as anything. There wouldn't be. Whereas here you've got different quintiles, so the lowest to the highest. And this is from 18,000 children. Right, so a big study. So what's interesting is that you've got tremendous range in all your groups. So the issue about the standard deviation in these populations is really interesting. People they all pay attention to the mean. So the means or the medians are interesting too, right? But the range is the interesting thing. Because when people start doing anecdotes about any of these stories, you can bet your ass that they're picking some bit of this distribution which happens to be convenient for them. So, for example, SLI. So where's SLI, right, in this group? So SLI actually sort of doesn't exist anymore, does it? That's from last week, because I don't know where it was, recently. But that idea of a very specific set of symptoms which are not conditioned by social factors. And that was originally what the intention was in that definition. So it doesn't really include these. They sort of drop out almost by definition. And my suspicion is they're probably around here mostly. And what's interesting, many of you will know the Manchester, Conti Ramsden study. Is it called Manchester Child Language Cohort? So there's no social conditioning in that. There's no social factor which predicts those children. And that's because you've actually got a very narrow distribution of people who end up in language units. So you've got a very odd population there. So it's sort of ungeneralizable because those language units often don't exist anymore. Or they do, they're full of autistic children. So things have moved on from the 80s. So that population probably isn't captured anywhere now. So generalising that population to other similar populations is sort of a bit tricky. And there's an interest. So anyone involved with the Manchester Child Language Bill? So there's a new paper just being presented. I'm not going to go into the details of what they're like when they're 25. And what's interesting is that they've got a comparison group in there. So you're comparing a comparison group with the children who've been. So they've got a small proportion of those who are left behind, right, in the study, right? So the attrition is poor, but that's understandable. But then they've got a control group which are matched for language, and that is the only thing they're matched on. So the assumption is that these are equivalents. Now, that to me is an astonishing thing to say. Because clearly we have no idea whether they're equivalent on anything except the language. So the ability to extrapolate from these studies, this is why I quite like cohorts. They're a bit unwieldy, to be honest, and the measures are a bit limited sometimes. But they're good because you feel quite confident that you're getting the real shape because you've got the whole population. If you don't do that, then you're up to this selective bias problem, which everybody gets involved with at some stage. Right, so this is the same graph, right, except in different places. So this is in Australia, that's in Victoria, and in Australia they've got policies to reduce inequalities. They're quite an equal society, and what happens is this starts flattening out. I don't actually have the data from Canada, but you get the same thing there too. So people have done comparisons between the US and the UK. This is Bruce Tomplin's Iowa study, which is a bit of an odd study too in terms of its sampling. For some reason that group seems to be doing rather well, which is sort of difficult to explain. Anyway, but you'd expect, and so if you look at the population data in America, you get a more marked gradient, mostly, not actually in Bruce's data very much. Because they have policies which exacerbate inequalities. You know, they have policies which encourage it, as indeed we do. So we have economic policies and taxing policies which purport to be supporting people at the bottom end, but actually, as you know, child poverty has gone up massively in the last 5 or 6 years. So there are lots of things going on at the moment which I think are going to have a bearing to some of your discussions later on. I don't know whether they will, it depends on your sampling. This is a study that we did, and this is, there was a study done by Anne Locke in Sheffield a few years ago, and it's about prevalence. And what she did, so we then repeated it, or tried to do it anyway. What she did was she said, well, what would you expect in terms of these language delays? And these are the usual sorts of chopping up psychometric distribution type approaches. And you'd expect, 16% to be below 1 cent, obviously. I don't tell psychologists that. So, and what we found in this, just one primary school in Edinburgh, so you might think Edinburgh's a bit posh, isn't it? So, it wouldn't necessarily find it. Well, of course, there are bits in all these places where there's massive, very high levels of disadvantage, as you would find if you went to some areas, and you could predict what sort of results you would get. Now, these are pretty similar to the ones that Anne Locke got. So she's getting proportions of 40% or whatever, 50%. She went up to 50%. And you think, God, that's impossible. But the reason, one point I'm trying to make is that's the baseline. Nothing is not the baseline. But you've still got, double the numbers you would expect. In cohort studies, it doesn't work quite like that. So these are highly selective. This is a population which had, they were all within the first quintile, but they were in the far end of they were on that previous diagram. They were sort of stuck in the corner here. So wherever you take your size, you can predict what sort of proportion you will get. Unless you're making cases that there's other things going on, so genetic things, for example, which are equally distributed across the population, if they are. And I think probably the big twin study suggests that they're probably not. But anyway, so I'm not going to go into all these details, but these are 3 of these studies: the Millennium Cohort, Growing Up in Scotland, Early Language in Victoria study, and this figure should be 16%, according to what I've just been telling you, in this bottom quintile. So it should be 16% across the piece. The numbers here are substantially lower. Here, so you're talking about 20% or so on the whole in the bottom quintile. So what that tells you is maybe that Anlock study, I mean, it could be this is to do with the British ability scales or the tests that are being used here, but these are all standardised tests, you know, so you have to go with that to some extent.
But the Millennium Study is the UK.
Yeah, sorry.
And that's, so in fact that doesn't fit with what you said, where you said that in Scotland and in Australia there are actually policies to reduce inequality, but in fact they've got a higher number in the first quintile than the Millennium Cohort.
It's an interesting one. I'm not sure that we've managed to tie those things together.
No.
They do have some separate policies, and they're actually much more cohesive with their early education work now than they are in England. But this is from some time ago, so it's from the born in 2000.
I just was trying to...
Yeah, no, I'm not sure about that. So I can see the policies, but can you detect the policies when you look at these sorts of data? And that's quite a big ask. We did some work last year with Growing Up in Scotland where they were insisting that they had this book reading exercise that they were rolling out across the country on the internet and then vans that went round to all the villages and all that stuff. And they said, well, we have these two cohorts of children in Growing Up in Scotland before and afterwards, and we want you to compare these two because we think it's going to show that you've got an effect, right, of these interventions. Now, of course, when I said, well, tell us about what the effect, what the interventions was and how many people got them and all that stuff, they were not very good about that because that didn't seem to be the point to them. But of course, it makes a huge difference. And in fact, it's very difficult in cohorts to detect intervention effects. You probably can over policies which are really consistent over a long period of time. But they're not very sensitive to that. And this is now, we're going on to another bit of work which is very current in the UK, 2010, but it's still assumed to be the main things which is driving health. Right? So this is moving away from Frank Field, who was talking about development, but actually opportunities generally. And now Michael Marmot's review. Are you familiar with this? Okay, so this is worth looking at. He deals with everything, right? So a bit like Field. And he has 6 priorities about reducing inequalities. And what he's making a very strong case that very early work is what the whole thing is prefaced on. And he says, enabling, so this is the one I picked out, but there's lots of other things, enabling all children, young people and adults to maximise their capability and to have control over their lives. Now you might say, well, that's just political speak, you know, but he's not a politician, he's actually a doctor. And what he's become incredibly well known internationally for his work in this area. And he produced a load of graphs which all look the same, which is sort of reassuring. So this one's birth weight. Well, actually, this one's not quite the same, is it? Birth weight seems to be sort of flat. If you took different countries, you would find that pretty different. So in developing countries, that would be very different, for example. This is all from Millennium Cohorts and those sorts of data sets. So this is postnatal depression. This one's being read to every day. And this one's regular bedtimes. Right? Now I tried this one, I showed that graph to people in Greece recently, and they thought this was very funny, right? Because they didn't really have this idea of this sort of Protestant thing about regular bedtimes. It wasn't their thing at all. So it's culturally sort of interesting. And reading, everyone says they do that. You know, and we don't really know whether there are any differences between countries as to how much do or how many people do or what proportion of people do or don't. Now this you're very familiar with, it's civilized. So this is a picture tells 1,000 words, or whatever the expression is. And it's pretty amazing because this is everywhere now. And you use it, I know, but based on 42 kids, for me that's pretty amazing. You know, actually, how many samples would you get direct government, 42 children to direct government policy? But it's very big. And in fact, there's a huge plan, which are you linked in with the 3 million words group in Chicago? Yeah, so there's a big word gap initiative in the States. It's all based on this. And in fact, it's on Hillary Clinton's website, right? So she got in on it as well. And if you look, actually, it's the Clinton Foundation. So they picked this up too. Although quite how busy they are at the moment, I'm not sure. But anyway, they picked this up as based on this, right? Not based on all the other stuff, or not based on sort of population samples. And they have got populations. Well, they've got one population sample in the States, which is called the Eccles B, or it's an Eccles B and Eccles K. And they are the child population studies. And they could do that with this, but they haven't done it with the ECHLs. Unfortunately, we can't access ECHLs because you have to have an American computer or to be located in America in order to do that. Whereas the MCS you can access from the luxury of your own desktop at any point, as is the Growing Up in Scotland, actually. And if you're interested in doing this sort of work, Growing Up in Scotland is the most accessible of them all. It's the best catalogued, it's the easiest to use. And they've got 5,000 kids in there, so we're not 18, but who's complaining? 5,000 seems reasonable enough. It's very well indexed, so it's easy to use. I think the problem with some of these studies, and there was an old BCS 70, which I'll mention in a moment, which is a nightmare to use, because it was developed on bits of paper and cards and things in the 1970s. And it took them about 20, and they realised that no one was using the data. No one used the data for about 20 years. Well, very little of it. The language data wasn't touched between 1975, when it was collected, and when we did some work in 2004. And it's because it took them 20 years to get onto a computer. And it was in a box under somebody's desk, which is what happens to most of these cohorts. Data. Right, so just following on from that. So, have you seen this? Now, this is something which, if you're interested in the Hart and Risley story, this is where you should be going, right? Because this takes them from 5 through to 14. And this is a study which is called Too Many Children Left Behind. And it is all done by analysts who work with cohort data. And this is it's not looking at language explicitly, it's looking at cognitive skills. And what you've got is the same sort of pattern as you had before, in time along the x-axis. This is reading, I'm sorry, so that's reading. So what you've got here is the top and the middle. So this is the same as Hart and Risley, the same principle. You see, you've got 3 groups, but you've got thousands of kids in here. And what they were trying to describe was actually within each group you get movement. So this is interesting because if you're trying interventions of any sort, this is the counterfactual you're working against. This movement, which is why it's very difficult to get big effect sizes in educational interventions, because there's so much movement anyway. But what you're seeing is these things are beginning to start to cross over. And there was a very interesting graph which got very exciting response from the Cameron government when they came in, and in fact, slightly oddly, it was a graph that was used by both the Labour Party and the Conservative government at the same time, which seems a pretty good achievement, actually. So, and this is this one. So it's called the Feinstein graph. Has anyone come across Leon Feinstein? So he's a very interesting person. He's an economist by background, and he was the research director for the EIF, the Intervention Foundation, and now he works for the Children's Commissioner for England. And this graph, he produced it about 10 years ago. And this is again the same idea, time over the space, this is months, and he's using the British cohort study. So this is the ones who were born in 1970, and he's looking at what happens to the highest and the lowest groups. He's dropped out the middle group, so the blue colour ones in the Hart and Risley disappeared. Right? Of course, when you extrapolate like this, it's easy to get visual effects which look really interesting. This is what happens here. So what you've got is, and you put this into quotients. Now, from a psychological point of view, this would be a nightmare, right? I find it difficult as well. But what he does is he puts together a number of items at any one time, which aren't necessarily comparable. They're sort of in the same area. What you would like is, test, and it's the same test with the same items all the way through, and that pretty much doesn't happen. In the Millennium Cohort study, you do have the British ability scales at 4 points. Although the scale differs, but the standardisation sample is the same. So essentially the story here, and it's touched on in that previous slide, but he makes this case very strongly, and this is why it's got into the whole issue about life chances, is that here are children who are, these ones are the ones who are not very able, and these ones are higher social groups, and these are the lower social groups. So these are the very able ones, and this is the lower social group and the highest social group. And generally speaking, what you see is that the ones who are have very low, and if you have low SES, you do pretty badly, which is pretty sort of expected generally. And similarly with high, you do pretty well. Now, what they were worried about was this, right? And this created a lot of policy discussion in the previous government. And in some ways, it was behind some of the life chances, because what it's saying is these people who have the capacity are not getting the chances. They're losing out over time. Now, this then became a big hype, sort of, you can imagine the statisticians got on with this, you can imagine it. And so they've been back over this and they've tried to redo it in different studies. And so they've tried to redo it with the Millennium Cohort study and then get the same effect. Now, of course, Einstein argued, well, this is the 70s, where there were more inequalities, and maybe things don't happen quite so much in 2005. You know, I don't know. So I'm just giving it to you because I think it's an interesting discussion. This was published in something called Econometrica. So not the most useful handy journal for most of us. It's full of algorithms which you can't understand. But in this case, it's a very interesting story, I think. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to something else, and I don't know whether you've been involved with this, which is the Save the Children campaign, Read On, Get On. Were you involved with this?
No, I think you can.
Yeah, well, I'm going to tell you a story then, right? Okay. So these, Save the Children got very interested in this very early intervention, and partly, you know, it's driven by people like Feinstein. It's driven by Martin Rooster. You know, they're thinking, they're not coming out of nowhere. They're all these, young academic types who get involved in these charitable organisations, and they know where this stuff comes from. And so they started this exploration. They got us to do this, which is about child language development before the age of 3. This was another one which they did in Scotland, and that was the Read On, Get On campaign. And originally they said, we're only interested in reading, right? And it was based on this sort of information, which you've seen lots of. This is the PEARLS data. Are you familiar with PEARLS? So this is national data, international data, and this is about inequality in the reading gap. And Netherlands, we like Netherlands a lot, it's very good, I'll move to Holland, right? And we're sort of next to Romania and Bulgaria for inequalities on these particular scales. Now, for those of you, has anyone done any work on these things? So this is freely available data. Again, massive data sets, but you have to be a little bit careful with what you're looking at, and people sometimes over-extrapolate. Anyway, the point I'm making is that, say, the children were interested in this because it was saying, actually, we are creating inequalities through our system. We are exacerbating them. A rich country doing this is a very odd thing to do. And this I thought I'd just put in because you'll be interested in reading all our children, you'll be reading them and all the right things. So this is what people are actually reading to children. That's interesting because the poetry doesn't do very well. That's a bad thing. There's changes between 2010 and 2013. People always like this because they think, oh, I do lots of that. Text messages, woo, up there. Right. Instant messages, I suppose that. I'm not sure we got as far as Instagram and stuff like that. I'm not sure. I don't think even Save the Children had sorted that out. But it's interesting about what children are reading, isn't it? So a book isn't really a thing anymore. So book reading, well, it is a thing, but is it the thing that we should be interested in? Actually, because if people are using multiple sources, then we need to be able to tap those multiple sources as much as we do just the book. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this. So this is the Millennium Cohort study. Moving on from, this is about the stuff that we did for them, for Save the Children. So 18,000 children. We have 4 different periods, 3, 5, 7 and 11, with different scales of the British, what I've just said, British ability scales. Mostly naming vocabulary, so very simple sort of task, verbal naming task. And in 3 years we had a Bracken test of school readiness. Has anyone used the Bracken? So it's quite well recognised now. At 11 they have verbal similarities. What do these things have in common? I mean, as psychologists, mostly, you'll be very familiar with these sort of tasks. I'm not really bothered to explain them to you. So at this point, they had 5 years, they had 13,000 kids anyway. They'd never looked at that. So this was about the differences. So what we did is we split the children on school readiness. And again, we got bottom, top, in terms of their abilities on the school readiness task. These are sort of pre-reading tasks, the sort of things that you usually get in school readiness things. Bracket is used in the UK actually, but it's an American scale. And what we're looking at is the months of difference between the top and the bottom groups. So again, the same sort of model as we've seen before, presented in a slightly different way. So between the delay, the bottom 10 and the top 5%, we have differences of, 26 and 7 to 30 months between the top and the bottom. So you see, what happened was, say the children came to us and said, is language an interesting thing? You know, should we be interested in this in relation to literacy? They weren't really interested in it, I have to say. Because they, they like the Department for Education, they think children are born at the age of 5, essentially that's how it starts. So we tried to explain to them this is not what happens, and in the end they did put a whole chapter about language in it based on the stuff that we'd written, which was quite a move actually, quite an important thing. So I gave this talk somewhere and some very clever people said, well actually this is an interesting issue, these are real months in age, but of course the proportion of that to that is what is interesting. You see what I mean? So you can have absolute number of months, but what the absolute number of months means as you get older changes, of course. So we then went and looked at this and thought, yeah, that is quite an interesting point. And in fact, it does go down a bit. It does drop, the proportion. But that's a rather different question. So we did that, and then what happened was we got onto the front page of the Sun. Right? Now, it's very embarrassing. Those of you who work in universities, we're very keen on impact. So we do our best to try and explain to the publicity people what language is and why people speak it and things like that. And then they simplify it down to about 3 sentences, don't they? That's what usually happens. Now, in this case, they bought the front page of the Sun. Right? That's what happens. So say the children, they can put £1 million in operation by next week. They're so rich. And so they produced these fantastic graphics. And our impact people were a bit anxious about this whole thing, like getting onto the front page of the Sun. Those of you trying to get them to any of these newspapers will know how problematic that can be. So everyone wants to go in the Guardian because they understand what I'm going to say. But anyway, what they did was they were sifting stories. They sieved these stories to get like little films. And so this is David Valiant, who you all know, and he's a dad, and he writes children's books. And the story they wanted, actually, this is interesting about constructing stories. The stories they wanted was that dads reading to little boys is really important. In fact, that's not the story that you get from the Millennium Cohort Study, and we told them this. What you do find, actually, is that the dad's role changes. So the dads aren't very interesting, very significant to begin with, because it's the mothers doing the reading, it seems to be the case. Whereas what seemed to have happened by about 7 was that the mothers were doing much less of the reading, and in some cases the dads were getting involved at that point. So the dads then became very predictive, but not to do with boys and girls, it was the same. Nonetheless, they carried on with the story. So never get the truth in the way of a good story. So they just carried on with it. You know these people, and I've presented this to people in other countries, and they are as shocked by this because they can't see why we'd be having anything to do with this. And it's it's not quite what they think of. This is not England. It's not what we think. So anyway, but what was happening with Save the Children? So they said, indeed, we can and should be more ambitious in the future. The prize is turning this country from one where doors shut in children's faces into one where we break the cycle of disadvantage. Which, of course, was an admirable thing to say. And then they produced these 2 aids. Have you seen this? Exactly. So this one was prefaced on, if we hadn't been involved with them, they wouldn't have said that. Right. Whether they should have said it is another matter, because they didn't come back and say, can we do anything about it? And what's happened, so this is reading and that's language. So, but what's happened is that And is anyone involved with this, with the Save the Children? Because actually my understanding is that this read on Get On was actually ground down, it's ground into the dust a bit. They're not actually doing it anymore. So having whipped everybody up into a hysteria about it, they then, I think they proceeded quite a bit into it, which is, I think, sort of interesting. But nonetheless, the issue about language and literacy then gets stuck in this document. And I think that's important for me. It's important that these things do get tied together. So a little bit about adult outcomes. Right, so this is the British cohort study, another cohort study, of children born in 1970. This is the one that ended up in cardboard boxes for a long time. And nobody did much with it. So they have done more recently. And there was language data of sorts. They were tested, vocabulary was tested at 5, and this is what this is based on. And then we followed them up at 34. In fact, they are now in their 40s. If you're interested in middle-aged language, that could be interesting. Because nobody talks about the middle-aged people, do they? It's a bad deal. If you're very elderly, it's fine, and if you're small, it's fine. Otherwise, you're ignored. So this is following them up at 34. Anyway, so this is interesting, I think. And this is a measure of deprivation, sort of classic thing, which is from then. Right? So be careful now, because some of these things you think, well, would they be deprivation indices now? And of course, you have to be careful. You know, if you want a follow-up study, you've got to see them at the end, which means they're bound to be out of date. So by definition, they're going to be out of date. So this one still would be. That would be fine. This one, separation from the mother for more than a month in the first year. That would be fine. I think that would be very unusual now. More family moves. This is the first year of life. That's probably fine still. Unmarried, meaningless. Single mum. People have got some very varied views about this, but my sense is that's pretty meaningless as well. It's because it's actually heavily conditioned by social factors. It's the social factors that drive that. Actually, being a young mum is not a problem at all. So a single mum and a teenage mum, that's the point about the teenage mum. So these things are still, so what we did this scale, and what we were interested in is whether social factors drive what happens to people in their 30s. And what we did is we had three measures at 30. So one is literacy, and this is level 2 literacy. This is the level of literacy you'd expect of an 11-year-old. It's binary split, we use linear logistic regression. This is mental health, and this is a number of scales. The ones that actually they're all developed by Michael Russell, as far as I can tell. And they're quite complicated scales, so it's not like a plus or minus simple mental health thing. It's actually quite a complicated thing. And this was employment, and they had to be unemployed for more than a year before the age of 34, which is quite a lot. Of course, remember, those of you who can, that in the 80s there was very high levels of unemployment. Unlike the current recession, where that has not been the case, or at least you wouldn't be able to classify them like that. So these are 3 outcomes, and these are whether you're deprived on that scale, predicting what happens at 34 months. So we didn't predict from that.
Years or months?
8 years. Sure. Last question. It's very good question.
I am interested in the middle years. No, I don't ask them, but.
Yeah, so, and so you get, not surprisingly, deprivation associated with literacy, I won't surprise you at all, and unemployment, pretty significant there. Mental health, not, and I think that's quite interesting. So then we put in language, right, to see whether language has a bearing on that. And the language we were looking at in this case was language at 10 or 11, that sort of age. And what we're interested in is whether this changes. Does it attenuate? Does it reduce? Or does the language have no effect? Because lots of people would say that language actually isn't going to make a difference. I mean, we probably wouldn't, but lots of people would. So, and what you have is this. So, first thing is the deprivation drops out in terms of its significance. Verbal similarities becomes, not surprisingly, much more significant with it, with the literacy, but comes in and predicts both these things. So what we were saying is that language is a better predictor than your social background by the age of the end of primary school. That's an interesting thing, if that's true. Because that implies that social risk has sort of got washed out by the child's attainment, as it were. Which I think is sort of interesting, that one. Oh yeah, so, and this is an extension of the same piece of work. We separated them out, and we published this, you've probably seen this. So we had a typical group at 5, we had non-specific language group. This is children who had low vocabulary at 2 more standard deviations below the mean, and poor copying skills, so they had general difficulties. And this is the sort of SLI type group, which had very poor vocabulary and not other things. Now you might say, well, vocabulary isn't an index for SLI, which is true. So there we get into some simplifying assumptions about this. I'm not pretending they are a classical clinical group of SLI. But they don't have IQ or non-verbal skills difficulties. And what you see is, and this is all in one graph, right, so it's all pretty significant. So if you have general language difficulties, you're 4 times as likely to have literacy difficulties, 3 times mental health, and nearly 2 times poor employment. Specific language difficulties, in the way that I've just defined it, is associated with these things, but much less so in the case of the literacy. So in some ways the SLI bit is quite protective, fun enough, because it doesn't have such a big effect. The mental health thing is interesting, because people make a lot of this story about children with language problems having mental health difficulties. And I would say that if you take a group of children with severe problems, either mental health or language, you will see the language or the mental health overlapping. So the occurrence, the prevalence rate will be much higher in those populations. But the prediction is much more difficult. So the association, the correlation over time is much more difficult to demonstrate. And obviously it doesn't work over this period of time. One of the interesting things is this one, which is that the employment rates, or the risk for employment, was worse for the children with language difficulties. And the only way we can explain this is that these children absolutely don't have any schemes in terms of employment in their 20s. Whereas people with these sort of difficulties, there could be learning difficulties, that sort of stuff, there are plenty of schemes. Even then there were plenty of schemes for them, so they may have looked like they were employed. But that's all I can say about that. I don't say there's anything specific about literacy. But interesting, with the follow-up from the Manchester study, they continued to have, then it's much less very interesting, let's say, if it comes out, because they have very, very sophisticated measures of employment. This is just where you employ, where you employ. Whereas they're talking about types of employment and where people ended up, which I think is probably more interesting than this. So a little bit about interventions. How are we doing for time?
Fine.
So the analysis we just presented there, that's in the statement report?
No, that one isn't. That was in a report that we published in 2009 or 10 or something. So that's in the Journal of Speech and Hearing Research. The other one, so the one about risk and the role of 10-year verbal similarities, we haven't actually published that. We haven't got around to it. But it's the same sort of data, though. So, is that okay? Yeah. I mean, just get in touch if you need more information about that. So a little bit about the effects of interventions. Originally what we did is we did this Cochrane review. I'm not going to go through it all because it gives you age and age ago. In fact, we are redoing it. I keep saying this. In fact, it looks like researchers have done this week, so I think we're actually ready to go for it again. And we have been doing some work for the EEF, looking at actually randomised studies, which are these ones, but also quasi-experimental studies since 2000, and we found no less than, I think it's 40 studies since 2000, which are either quasi-experimental or randomised controlled trials. Some of them are speech therapy, but quite a lot of them are language-focused interventions in schools, which seems appropriate, but well designed for things. But for this particular bit, we generated this database, which many of you will come across. We started off with a survey of speech and language therapists, and had quite a lot of responses, 500 or so. And we asked them what they did. And what we tried to do is to get a balance between what the evidence said, I in papers, and what people said they did. So trying to match them up. So people said they did lots of stuff, and then we went and looked it all up. we looked up whether there was any evidence behind it. And in most cases there wasn't. In some cases there was. In some cases, some of the most commonly used schemes had the least evidence behind them. So we're trying to shift people's perception of what they do. It doesn't work if you say, oh, just stop everything. No, you can't, because people will do something. So they do use what is useful for them. But what works is partly a repository, but it's also trying to have a direction of travel, trying to move people towards a more evidence-based approach. And it works, actually. People are trying to get their stuff into this database now. And it's quite interesting because they sort of lobby us. It's sort of exciting being lobbied. It's unusual for me. Because they see that people read this and they say, well, actually, that's what's got to be commissioned in the future. So this is our review, which you've seen. I don't need that, actually. That's not necessary. This is the sort of stuff that comes out of it. I say, well, what's interesting here is that you look at the heterogeneity of these studies. And what you want is these confidence intervals to come in. You get a huge range of response. But this was the first time anyone had done this, so it's an interesting phenomenon. And we, of course, in this field, we don't replicate anything. So in psychology, they replicate all the time, don't they? Although last year I think we were told there wasn't much point because it didn't do anything. They weren't the same. Is that right? There's a big thing in science or something about it. But anyway, people don't replicate in our field. So it's very there are only group of interventions which have been replicated are probably the Hannon group. That group of studies has had more. Those interventions have had more evaluation. So this is the what works thing, and as I say, we've got something like 12,000 people signed up to this because you have to sign up to it to use it, which surprised me. Actually, I was surprised that people were that interested in it. So I think it is catching something here. And I think, and what we have is there's stronger evidence, and then so strong evidence, we have moderate evidence, and then we have indicative evidence. And some people have come up to us and said, why do you bother with indicative evidence? Because it's, if you look at the hierarchies that I have in health terms, nobody ever has indicative evidence in those hierarchies, right? And it's true. So what we've included them because we want to encourage people to think it's possible to start evaluating their own interventions using quite simple sort of approaches. And some of the indicative ones are very simple. And it does work. People do send us stuff that they're doing, and we do try and include them. And we do have, well, I don't, they do, Communication Trust, has a sort of interaction with people who are developing their own interventions to try and promote their the quality. And in fact, they've got a session in March, actually, they've set up in London somewhere, which is about this. Are you?
I don't
know, maybe, but so, but so that is again, it's a part of this sort of determination, not just about flogging this, because actually there's no money in it, because it's funded by the DFE. This came from the Better Communication Research Programme, and sort of everything is free. If you go to another country and you say that, they sort of go, "Wow, how does that work?" You know, because everyone's always trying to make money out of it, and that distorts everything. This is actually a very open way of doing things. And I think over a period of time, you know, it's been running for a few years, and it has made a bit of a difference. We've been back and been a bit stricter about them. So, the Derbyshire language scheme, which everyone says they use all the time, has dropped out a bit. Because we included that because everyone said it was what they did.
Do they have any indication of if people are using?
No. No, they do. What they do is they write round to people who've signed up, and they say, "Tell us." And so. But there's plenty of room for bias in that. Right? So they then have a sort of survey summary of feedback. So they ask them how they use it. Yeah. But I don't want to overstep that. Yeah, so I don't. You know, I'm not sure actually. So this is now the EEF. So this is nothing to do with. So have you come across these people? So these are. They have so much money for their trials that they don't know what to do with it. So they started off with, I think, 530 million quid. And my story was that they'd given it back to whoever funded them because they'd invested it all in the stock exchange because nobody took the money off them. And so they had so much money, they're actually making a lot on this. I'm not sure how that works. Anyway, so what they do, and this is a toolkit they've got. which you can look up almost anything you're interested in as a teacher. Anything to do with classroom size or use of phonics or teaching assistants, do they work? And they will have trials on them, many of which they have funded, or what they do is they summarise other people's stuff. And then they do this thing which is incredibly clever and from a research point of view, deceptive. Right? So they do these things, these things here, and these are on all of them. So they've got the same things on all of them. So this one is how much it costs, this one is how robust is the evidence, and this one is how much gain do you get for an average child from all these studies. And you can see how much more exciting that is than doing forest plots in a Cochrane review with confidence intervals and going, oh, I'm not sure we look. That sort of academic thing, you know, oh, that would be a bit of this and a bit of that. So they go, no, it's all this, right? So this is the oral language intervention, so they're sort of cheap, fairly robust, and they give you 5 months advantage over a year from a group of children who are not given any intervention in language. So I'm not selling this particular view. We just tried to do some of their work. We tried to take this padlock thing. I was trying to get it to work, actually. When we actually followed their rules, we came up with much lower robustness, which I thought was quite interesting. And that was, we sort of had a vested interest in saying it was better. So, anyway, so this is ongoing, right? And what's happening with these people is that they're funding trials. So those of you, have people applied for trials for them? You should be. Absolutely. Because, you know, the average trial is about, well, it's not like an NIHR trial, which is like 1.5 million. It's about 500,000. Universities aren't so bothered because they don't do overheads and all that stuff. But nonetheless, you can get a lot of interesting things done. And you're very linked into a lot of your schools, so it's a really good opportunity for you. And recently they started up this thing which is called the Northeast Literacy Campaign. Now, by literacy they mean sort of everything, not just reading books. And they included language in it, perhaps because we're there, I don't know. Just keep on going on at them. They're rolling out in schools their trials. They're trying to get their better trials out into schools. So what they're doing is that they're not just saying, oh, here it is. You know, like a Cochrane review, you go, ooh, here it is. You know, and then people read it or don't read it. But they're saying, not only do we do this, but we're going to now try and get schools to do the interventions. So that's what's going on at the moment. And they've got guidance that's coming out. The guidance for Key Stage 1 is out already. So all schools that you're working with will have been in receipt of that guidance and will either be doing it or ignoring it. But it'll be there. Slightly oddly, the next one after Key Stage 1 is Key Stage 2, which is coming out in September, I think. And the one, maybe in the summer. And the one after that is early years. So, for me, as a developmentally inclined person, that sort of seems a bit like nonsense. But in terms of their priorities, Key Stage 1 is the number one thing for literacy. So they are very interested they're getting interested in early years. And they're trying to fund trials in the early years, but haven't been very successful so far. That was only from last year. So if you're interested in that, that would be a good place to go. And it's really easy to fill out the form, but of course everyone else fills out the form as well. So unlike with the ESRC, which has a sort of model of, we select out most of the people who might apply because they can't be bothered to fill the forms. And they do it in August, right? Which is the standard practice now. In the EF, they have them twice a year, these calls. There's one, I'm sure the next one is, I can't remember, anyway, it's on the website. And they're very easy to fill out the forms. So if you're interested in doing that, probably would be, you'd be a good team to do it. You know, definitely, insofar as you're a team. I'm not sure how much of a team you are. So the other thing I wanted to draw your attention to, because I'm involved with this, so I'm involved with the other one, because we do some work on early years, and we want to do some of that classroom observation work in early years. And what we found in the Northeast, so the schools buy into this programme in the EF, and they have to give, I don't know how this works, 300 quid for being a part of it. And you could have thought, oh, that seems like we're up allowed for collecting all that money. But they think that seems to be the way they do it. And they were asked what their priorities were, primary schools. And they said two things. One of them was writing. Not literacy. One of them is writing, interestingly, because Finland, I believe, has stopped teaching writing completely now. So, but anyway, in the northeast they're very keen on writing. And the other was early child language. Right. So this is the good thing, and this actually happened with your talk at the town, which was here. Was the talk at the town, as I understand, is anyone involved with talk at the town? Yeah, you were, so as I understand it, it might be wrong actually, but as I understand it, originally that was generated by the head teachers. Head teachers wanted it. So there was a lot of pressure coming in the system because they wanted some support for the thing that they had identified as being a problem. I don't mean the trial actually, because the trial went through, that's what I mean, the first bit. Yeah. So the important thing for me is if you want to get these sort of studies working, actually embedding it in the school, which means them embedding it in the school, not you probably, is very important. And in this case, in the northeast, they're actually saying, without knowing that we were flogging them something, well, we weren't telling them, we were going to do something with them, they said, actually, that's the thing we would like most help with. Which I think is interesting, because you'd probably find exactly the same thing would happen here. There's nothing special about the northeast like that. I mean, they have lots of problems, as you discussed. George Osborne was telling you last week about being the northern powerhouse. You know what's happening with your schools, and the same thing is true for us. They don't do very well. Although, interestingly, what he said was, we want to get everybody to be nearer the mean, or the average. And it's brilliant. This sort of statistical knowledge of means is brilliant. So the idea the average wouldn't then go up if you got everyone to get better. It's like we want to get more than half the population over the average, is what they said. Anyway, so the last thing I want to refer to is this, which is the cost action. So you may be aware of this, I don't know. These are big research networks across Europe, funded by the EU. God bless them. And we got the money in this case, so we wouldn't be able to get it in the future. But so cost actions are networks of researchers from all over Europe. And we set this one up about language skills. And we started off with 6 countries, and I thought, you've got to have at least 6 countries in order to apply. And we now have 34 countries involved. And what that tells you is not me flogging it to them again. It's people, they find out about these networks, and people are interested in child language. So these are assortments of people. We have linguists in there, and psychologists, and we have lots of speech therapists, and we have pedagogues and all sorts of other folk who do things with children with language difficulties. And what we're starting off to do, because we wanted to get this to work across Europe, is actually to do more reviewing. They wanted to do this. And so they're going to be doing some more reviewing, and they're going to be doing language-specific reviews and that sort of thing, to try and get more access to. So what it's doing is raising the profile of the whole issue of intervention evaluation. I have to say, in most of these countries, they really don't have much sense of it. So it's quite new. But of course, from a linguistic point of view, it's really interesting if you're a linguist and interested in these issues, because you could choose with your 30 countries, or whatever it is, which languages you wanted. So, for example, if you were interested in issues around morphology or interventions related to morphologically rich languages and morphologically impoverished languages, you could choose them really from this sort of network. And we hope to be going for Horizon 2020 stuff. So we've got to move on actually. But in order to try and make use of this. But if you're interested in this cost action, you can join it and you can come along to meetings if you want to. We only fund, we have a management committee, which you can imagine is a bit overwhelmingly busy, but with about 80 people on it. But we have these management committee meetings where other people come along too, other people are interested. And we have these things called short-term scientific missions, which sounds fantastic. And it means you can go anywhere in Europe, but I suppose it could be the world, but probably anywhere in Europe, and you get paid for going there for a week or 2 as a researcher. So you can go to any lab, they use that term generically, and if people will receive you, you can get funded to go there. So it's very good for young researchers. If you have young researchers who are interested in intervention, it could be right up their street. So that's the website. That's in Newcastle, this one, but it's We've got landing pages in different languages. We've got a questionnaire going out about practice. Actually, to be honest, from a research point of view, it's a bit of a nightmare. A questionnaire about practice across 30 countries. Imagine what a terrible thing it's going to be. Anyway, we've done it, and translations are coming in now. So we've got about 6 or 7 translations, and we hope to have it out later on this year about practice in different countries. I don't think I'm not going to. So these are the working groups which may be interesting. These ones obviously would apply to you, the linguistic and psychological underpinnings of interventions. This one's about delivery, and this one's about social and cultural context of intervention. So all pretty interesting stuff. This is obviously therapy practitioner type people are very interested in this, but we have more the psychologists and the linguists maybe in there. Mixed up quite a lot. And they're doing reviews at the moment, and in our survey we're covering all these things. So we're asking them about theory, and of course this is group number 1, that's the first bit of the survey, being sensible and logical, and everybody told us to stick it at the end, because they would scare the pants off everybody. And it is pretty scary. If you look at the things, how much theory do you use in your interventions? You know, it's an interesting one, that one. So anyway, it's been going for a year or a bit, and it's developing quite well. We've got very active meetings, so we have 80 or 90 people or so at these meetings. And I guess for me, it's the next generation of young researchers interacting with each other is one of the most important things. It's an opportunity. We prioritise what are they called? ESRs, so early stage researchers. So if you're an early stage researcher and you're interested in these things, get hold of this, look at the website and see if there's anything you can link yourself into. Interestingly, this one, which to me is really interesting, the sort of anthropology, there's very little on that. It's one of the weakest areas. And to me, it actually is critical, you know, how you deliver these things. But people don't do it. They're very cognitively orientated, I think. So in summary, so life chances represents a helpful frame of reference when you look at looking at whole populations. I said that I was going to check. I checked because I was coming here about whether this term had disappeared. Because in June last year, they were due to have a life chances strategy coming out. The government was releasing it, which was going to trigger a whole lot of activities. And then they came in after Brexit, and everyone sort of forgot about it. Well, they didn't actually. They shelved it. And then it was coming out in the autumn, and then a book came out from Child Poverty Action Group about life chances. That was in October, November time. And now they're talking about social mobility and things like this, and opportunities in a rather generic sort of way. And I was thinking, well, has this life chances thing disappeared off the face of the earth? I'm told that something is going to come out, but I'm not sure what it is. And then I looked up something from the Cabinet Office last week, and this will be interesting to you, I think. So do you know what social impact bonds are? Yeah, so I said, you
don't ask me, I've heard of them, and I've read the paperwork.
So this is about people trying to monetize outcomes. Right. And the previous government was interested in this, and it was, people weren't quite sure where it was going. Anyway, what they've done is they've released something called the Life Chances Fund. It was actually released, I think the autumn statements actually, which is a lot of money for life chances work, right? I haven't said that it was going to go. In fact, it's 80 million quid, you would please to know. And this last month, so if you have any possibilities here, this is actually for ICANN and for other groups, if you have any links with local authorities, they can get funding, and one of the things that they're interested in is language development in early years. I only picked this up this week actually, so I'm not on top of it yet. But all I'm saying is that it hasn't gone away. The term life chances is going around the houses a bit, and politicians own it and discard it, and then it comes back again, and it looks like that may not have gone away. So we've got a clear and consistent gradient. I think that's pretty pronounced in most population. Adult outcomes for children with difficulties at 11 years is sort of recognisable, but beware determinism. There are a lot of people who are saying we need to be careful with these models because you can say, oh, it's correlated, you get a significant result, but with a significant result with 5,000 children, there's a lot of significant results. And if you get small betas, then you have to be careful that you're not over-interpreting the data. So significance is not the only thing. Do you still use statistical significance? It's sort of gone out of date, isn't it? Now?
Among the young researchers, it's an ongoing discussion.
Oh, fantastic. But it's an interesting one, because actually I'm still teaching, I still research methods, and I realised that I'm teaching them p-values on the one hand, and knowing actually that's not what you should be teaching them, but it's just so easy to teach. So I'm conscious that we need to move, absolutely. So intervention has been shown to work. There's quite a lot of positive effects. If you look at the EEF, they say that when they do these big scale-up trials, that they are happy with effect sizes of 0.2. Now, if you know anything about Cohen's effect sizes, you'll know that comes out as a very low effect size. But what they say is that makes a difference across a whole population. So it's interesting at a population level. Because quite a lot of their big trials, these are trials with 300 in each arm, these big trials, which we don't really have very much of, are showing very modest effect sizes. So, and the other thing is, I just want to draw your attention to the EIF produced a report called Foundations for Life last year, which is about interventions for everything to do with young children, not to do with language. There is a whole section on cognitive and language interventions, but you might find this interesting because they have this hierarchy, and they've got a set in the top of their hierarchy is interventions that are ready to be rolled out everywhere. There's not very many of them, and they don't have any language ones, you'll be pleased to know. But there are some at the next level down, which are language ones, which they say are at that sort of level. So that Foundations for Life is an interesting document if you're interested in intervention, and they try to make a very good evidence-based case in that. And the other thing I want to draw to your attention to is the big lottery, Better Start. Are you involved with that?
Yeah.
So that's very interesting, I think. They're trying to do what Sure Start didn't do, is my understanding. So Sure Start said, we want to do everything, it'll be lovely, and then pick up the results later on, and it sort of wasn't. So, because there was no control of what people did, and there was not much embedding of a lot of the work that they did. Whereas these people had masses of funding. So it's only in Blackpool, this one, isn't it?
It's Blackpool, Bradford, and that's
Yeah. So there's a number of, there's 5 sites, I think, in different places. But very interesting. I mean, they haven't published anything yet, and maybe just I'm not
It's only just started.
Yeah, it's very new.
Yeah, yes. So, but interesting place to see, because they're very interested in language, right? So socio-emotional development is one of the things, diet is one of the things, nutrition, diet, and speech and language. So I think there's some very interesting stuff coming out of that. I'm not sure which, Dartington's involved, isn't it? But I'm not sure which universities are involved. Okay, and there's a whole issue about whether you could reduce, if you affect language, can you reduce social inequalities? And it's an interesting question. Because when you think about a logic model, you have your outcomes, which are your language outcomes, but your outputs, or impact sometimes, at the end of the logic model, is a much more extensive sort of impact of your intervention, and pretty much no one ever does it. So we actually complete void there of knowing what we can say about that. Okay, and that's the point about the EU. Right, okay, that's enough. Thank you very much.